Hey guys, in today's video we're going to go a little bit deeper into sewing with vegan leather specifically. So this applies to pleather, PVC leather, fake leather, whatever you want to call it, those fake faux leather type products. The techniques that I'm going to show you here and the supplies that we're going to use will apply to any of those types of fabrics. So let's just go across the screen here, and you can see over on the left, up the top, I have several types of vegan leather product. Two that have some punched out design on them, and then just a flat, smooth piece of a solid color. And each of these fabrics have a fabric backing on the back side. You can see more of that in the introductory video, but they're all vegan leather on one side, fabric backed on the wrong side of the fabric. So then let's go across the screen here from left to right, and we'll take a look at these other specific supplies. We have Scotch tape. We have the double-sided quilter's tape or binding tape, Wonder clips, which can also be replaced with binder clips. We have several machine feet here. We have a roller foot, which is right here first, a standard presser foot, and a Teflon coated presser foot. Then we have a rotary cutter. We're using a 28mm size, an acrylic ruler, and cutting mat for cutting out those pieces. Then right here in the center, we have some sewing machine needles, and there are a few different types I'm going to show you. You can use any of them interchangeably. It will just depend on your preference, how your machine works, and how it works with the fabrics. So we have the Microtex Sharp in a 90-14 size. Then we have some leather needles, same size, just a different type of needle. And then we have universal needles. And so I'll use those interchangeably and show you how they work using them on the same type of fabric. Then we have tailor's chalk, which you can use to mark your pattern pieces on your fabric. You can also use any marking pens or tools that you might have, but pinning on the fabric is going to be problematic, which is why we have Wonder clips for the sewing. So you're definitely going to want some sort of marking tool to outline your pattern pieces on your fabric. Then we'll take a little bit closer look at thread. Depending on if you choose to do top stitching or not, you might want to choose a slightly thicker, heavier weight thread. So you can see right here with these two threads, this one right here is a thicker weight thread. So if you're top stitching with this, it will have a nicer finish. This one right here is a standard thread. They're both polyester. You just, for the same reason, would want to test out on your fabric how those work with your needle, your fabric, and your machine, and see if it is worth trying a heavier weight fabric if you're going to do top stitching. Top stitching itself on the vegan leather is a little bit challenging. So in most cases, I might avoid that step entirely and just do a different type of technique, or choose a fabric like the punched leather, which gives me a little bit more character and texture, and I don't need that top stitching. And then lastly, in front of us, we have aluminum foil and wax paper, which we will demonstrate for a few of the sewing techniques. And of course, you're going to need a pattern to choose for your project. So some of the examples that we have that we'll illustrate will be using the Liberty Jane bomber jacket pattern. All right, so for step one, you're going to want to look at your specific fabric choice and the pattern, and look through the sewing techniques, the way the pattern is designed, and just make some choices up front if you can eliminate anything that might just bring in some extra challenges that are not necessary to complete the overall look. Because of your choice of fabric. So in front of us right here, this is a great example. We love the bomber jacket pattern. It has some really nice detail. It has a center back seam in the lower portion of the back of the jacket. It also has a back yoke. Now all of these pieces here in front of us, you can see that creates a separated lower back, which is cut two with the seam in the back, and then the upper portion is the back yoke cut on the fold. Now our choice is going to be this fabric here that has all this punched out design in it. It makes it a little bit more challenging to work with when the pieces are cut small, and it has a little bit of stretch in it. So it'll just be hard to line all these seams up really systematically because of the punched out design. So we have a supplemental instruction sheet that goes along with the bomber jacket pattern, just referencing what steps you can skip and how you can combine these pieces to create a simpler pattern. So for this specific example, we've taken these back two pieces. If you go ahead and just overlap that seam allowance and remove this center back seam, it's the same exact size as the back lining piece. So instead of using these two pieces, we're simply going to use this back lining piece for both the lining and the jacket. So the back of the jacket will not have the yoke seam and it will not have the center back seam. Then for the rest of the pattern, it's going to be assembled as the pattern describes. We have the front pieces cut to, it's just one piece, and we have sleeve pieces cut to, they are just one single piece. And then we've gone ahead for this particular fabric, just decided to not do these tiny little pockets on the front because of the punched out design. They'd kind of get lost in the mix anyway and aren't completely necessary to have an adorable looking bomber jacket. So we have these pieces and we're almost ready to cut out. On this type of fabric, I think my preference would be to not fold and cut on the fold, or even cut two out at the same time. Because of the pattern on the fabric itself, I would place each piece, making sure that I have the pattern positioned exactly where I want it, and then cut them out in a single layer, one at a time. So for these two pieces, that works great. We can do that as is. For this back piece, we're simply going to take a new piece of paper. I've folded it straight. I'm going to place this pattern piece right on that fold line. And then I would just go ahead and trace around or hold these together and just cut this out so that I have a new pattern piece that opens up flat and I have one back piece that I don't have to cut on the fold. Now we're ready to cut out the pattern pieces, and you have a few options. Some of these vegan leather fabrics you can pin into, and you could pin along the seam allowance. I would recommend pinning in the direction of the seam allowance so that if you have two holes, they are both inside the seam allowance and will be hidden when the garment is sewn together. Many of them are challenging to pin through and it creates lumps and is hard to cut around. So the other options would be to cut with your rotary cutter. You can either hold the pattern piece if it's small enough with your hands, as long as you can keep your hand in one place, and cut with the other hand without it shifting around. Another option is to use pattern weights if you have those. If you don't have those, there's a variety of things, like I happen to be a Diet Coke addict. So for me, I have those around pretty frequently. I can set that right in the center of my pattern piece, and then that's not going to go anywhere. And I could, after I've made sure that it's positioned exactly how I like, I can simply go around and cut out this piece. And then that leaves my other hand free so that I can actually hold the fabric if I need to on the outside edge as I'm cutting so that it's not shifting and pulling. And then the final option would be to lay the pieces on probably the wrong side of the fabric, and then use your marking tool. Depending on the color of your fabric, you could use tailor's chalk, you could use a marking pen, and simply go around these edges carefully and mark them, and then move your pattern pieces and just cut carefully along those lines. Then, as I mentioned before, we have the pattern pieces positioned exactly how we want to cut them out. So this is the back, it's one piece. The sleeve, we're going to need to cut two. So we'll cut it out and then we'll move it and cut out a second sleeve positioned exactly how we need it. And then for the front part of the jacket, you're going to do the same thing. And I would recommend with your pieces to cut it right side up for the one piece and then flip it over so that you have a mirrored piece, and you're cutting that in the position on the fabric exactly as you need it. So now really for step 2, it's about the machine and the sewing techniques. So we have a few test pieces of fabric here, and I'm going to test on small pieces of the same fabric that I want to sew my final garment on, just to determine the needle that I want to use, the stitch length, and the type of technique, even the type of foot, everything about that fabric. I'm going to test it out first on a small piece, and then we'll have the whole thing set and ready to go for our final project, and hopefully we won't run into any problems and we'll be able to sew that successfully. So in front right here, I have two different types of vegan leather. We have the punched leather that we cut out, and this one, like I mentioned, has a little bit of stretch in it. It's also pretty soft. It's not rubbery like the finish on this one is. This one's a little bit stickier, so this will have a little bit more of an issue going under your standard sewing machine foot. This one right here might actually sew fine on the standard foot, but if you have a Teflon or a roller foot, I would recommend that for any of these types of fabric. If you don't, we have a few options that we can demonstrate for kind of creating your own nonstick foot. So the first is to simply take a piece of foil and wrap your foot. Now we're doing this as carefully and as tight as we can, and then we will position this back on the machine, making sure that we have the area where the needle needs to go through cut out right there, and we'll push that back inside as well. The other option would be to take a piece of Scotch tape and do the same thing. Stick that to the bottom and use this side as your non-stick layer. So that's coating the bottom of the foot, and you make sure that you have your hole cut out for your needle to poke through as well. Now for the fabric choices itself, the other thing that I'll mention with this regular vegan leather is that it stretches in one direction, but it doesn't really stretch in the other direction. So as you're laying out your pattern pieces, being that there isn't really a grain on this fabrics, you could mix the direction. So if you have a piece that you know you're going to need to top stitch, say it's a zipper placket or a waistband, I would make sure that you cut that in the direction where there is no stretch. So lay your waistband piece along the fabric this way so that when you're stitching down that fabric, it doesn't have any give in it, and you'll get a better looking top stitched line with your non-stick foot or your roller foot than you would if your waistband was positioned this way and it's kind of pulling on it as you're sewing. That way your stitches are going to get bunched up and it won't be very even at all. And then finally, as it relates to the seam itself, we'll want to make sure that we have figured out what method we want to use so that we're not pinning those seam allowances. So we can position them right sides together and use the Wonder clip right on that seam allowance, and then that will hold those pieces together as we sew, and we'll simply pull these off as it gets close to that stitching foot area. Another option would be to use the double-sided quilter's tape, and you would just peel that off, place that down right inside that seam allowance line, and this is 1/8 inch wide so that we can stitch beyond that and not have the needle go through the tape itself. So you would have that positioned on the seam allowance edge of your fabric, and then you would carefully pull that paper off. And you can see right there, that leaves that tape right on the fabric. Then you would take your pieces right sides together, line them up, and then carefully position them. And then you're ready to sew, and you can run that right through your machine. And with most of these that are fabric backed like this seam goes perfectly. You can use your standard sewing machine foot on that. It's not going to stick at all. So if you pick a pattern like the aviator jacket where there is no top stitching and all the pieces are sewn right sides together, and then all the edges, sleeve, neck, and hem are just ribbing that is sewn on, that's fairly easy to do without needing a non-stick or roller foot. Okay, so here we are at the machine. I have my machine set at my straight stitch, and I am just going to bump this up to about a 3.5 stitch length on my selection. I find that this works best for the seams as well as the top stitching, but again, you're going to need to play around with it on your own machine to figure out what stitch length works best. Okay, now we're at the machine. We have a standard presser foot, and the stitch length is just a straight stitch. I have my two samples, one with Wonder clips and one with that double-sided quilter's tape, and we're just going to run through and show you how this stitches out with the regular presser foot. So you can see on this that sewed on the wrong side of the fabric without any problem. Like I mentioned before, we have the wrong side on both the top and the bottom, so there's nothing to stick on either this plate or the presser foot, and that stitched out fine. And then there you can see that seam looks fine. Now the other method is with the Wonder Clips, and you'll see that that is the same. You just have to do it a little bit slower so that you have time to remove those as you're sewing. But you'll go in, sew your stitches, pull off that clip. But you can see here already, I'm having a little bit more problem with that. So that double-sided tape actually works really well to hold that seam together and doesn't allow the fabric to shift from the top or the bottom. Now I can carefully try to fix this with my needle in the down position, reposition my fabric, try to make sure that I'm really keeping that 1/4 inch seam allowance. But if you look at this pretty closely, this actually looks horrible. So we started off pretty good, we got a little bit off track, and then we're shifting back to the proper seam allowance. So that one right there didn't work as well as simply using the tape and sliding that right through as we sewed. And then quickly I'll just show you that this other type of vegan leather on the outside of the fabric with that double-sided quilter's tape sews fine as well using a standard presser foot. And there you can see that it looks good. We have a nice even stitch line. The stitches are not bunched up at all. So now the trick really is going to come into play when we decide to stitch from the top side. So we can't really press this. You can press lightly with a cloth over the top of the vegan leather. You can try to press it from the bottom side, but it's not going to hold that down. So if you want to go through and top stitch these seams, I'll show you here how this works with a standard presser foot and then when we use the non-stick foot. Now I think when you choose to top stitch and you press this open, remember that you have that double-sided tape inside that seam allowance. So you're gonna want to stitch as close to this fold line for your seam as possible, and then we'll go back in and you can kind of carefully trim that off. But it's helpful to have the seam allowance when you're trying to guide this through under the presser foot. So we'll do this first right here with this standard presser foot, and you'll see how this works. So it is guiding it through. I am getting it to pull. Again, we have this fabric backing on the back side, so it's not sticking to the underneath, but it's a little bit of resistance against this presser foot. You can see it already kind of puckering right here around the foot. So that works. It is doable. You can see that it's pulled it. The stitching is very close together compared to the stitch length that was done on the inside. So if you look at these side by side, you can see that it is actually pulling against that finish and it's creating a much smaller stitch, and I didn't change the stitch length at all. So now I'm going to switch out my foot. On this machine, the whole entire foot comes off. Now I have this position. My needle has to stay in the center position with this foot. My stitch length is still set at a 3.5. So I have my seam allowance pressed to one side, both seam allowances together to the left. And I'm simply going to position this under the non-stick foot, trying to stitch about 1/8 of an inch away from that seam. So here you can see that, and we actually had a little bit of sticking at the beginning. You can see how this stitch length starts pretty tight and then evens out as it has more fabric to grab with the presser feet. So there's a few things we can do to resolve that. One would be to make sure that we have long enough thread tails at the beginning, and you can kind of gently pull on those as you begin sewing. The other would be to increase our stitch length and try to start with a larger stitch. Okay, for the second pass on this one, we are going to hold these thread tails from my first stitching line as we start stitching, and that'll help get it going a little bit better. The stitch length on here, we're still leaving at 3.5. And you can see right here, this looks nice and even. We have a good stitch line. No puckering in that fabric. It did start a little bit smaller, but it doesn't vary as much as that first pass when we were not holding those threads. So here you can see both of those versions side by side. So you can see how this started out so much smaller because we were not guiding that at all. And then this one here, nothing changed except that we held the thread tails from that first line of stitching, and it helped get it started a little bit more evenly. Now we're going to show you with this original standard presser foot coated in tin foil. I'm going to pop that back on, and we're going to see if this works in the same manner as the non-stick foot. So again, I'm just going to pull this under. I'm going to hold those thread tails. I'm going to try to stitch this about 1/8 of an inch away from my seam line. I'm going to hold these threads in the back, and we are going to start stitching. All right, well, you can see at my first pass, that did not work at all. The foil simply came right off, no matter how good I had that wrapped around the foot. So that first optional thing you might have heard clearly does not work. Now we're going to look at the Scotch tape on the back of the foot. So to do that, I'm going to place a piece on each side, just on the outside edges of that foot, and then we're going to run that through. So there we have that applied. You can see I've left this center area uncovered so that the thread and the needle can still poke through, and it's not even on there very evenly, but it's enough that it's out of the way. It's wrapped over the edges a little bit so that it can't fall off, but it already, I can feel the difference that seems like it should create a non-stick finish. And I think if you did this quickly enough and then removed it right after you were done with your project, you wouldn't be left with sticky residue on your foot and have a problem there where you're just trying to clean a new mess that you've created. So we're going to put that on the machine, and the same as the other examples, my seam allowance is pressed to the left, and I'm going to hold these tails in the back. And you can see that that actually works pretty well. I was holding those tails to begin, but as I go through, I'm not really having very much of the resistance from the fabric itself. And then there is that finished stitching. And you can see that this actually started pretty evenly, and then as I started to sew faster, it did get a little bit smaller. So the resistance on that is a little bit different. The non-stick foot, I think, did work the best. This right here is the non-stick on the bottom next to that Scotch tape covered standard foot. Side by side, so you can see that it kept the actual stitch length that I had selected the most evenly with the non-stick foot. And then here is a quick look at switching out with the leather needle. So we'll just look quickly with the top stitching how this needle performs, if at all, if it performs any differently. So we're going to slide this underneath the same way, and then go ahead and top stitch this piece. So here we have a look at the leather needle. It looks very even. It went through nicely from beginning all the way to the end, very evenly, very nice stitching line. So that actually looks like one of the best options of all the versions that we tried. Here we have them side by side. This was that first one with the standard presser foot where the stitching was pretty small at the beginning. And then this one, we held the thread tails and we're using the non-stick foot, and it looks pretty even. And then this one is the most consistent with the leather needle. So these were both done with that Microtex sharp needle, and then this last one was done with a leather needle that is the same size. So on these examples, this one to me right here looks the best. And again, you just want to practice on some scraps before you go ahead and sew and complete your project. And then we'll just go ahead and run that through as well on the punched vegan leather product, and you can just see the difference of how those sew out. Now you can see right away, right here, why I don't really recommend top stitching this fabric. It's stretchier and it is much more challenging to try to get that to lay flat and to top stitch smoothly. So with this design, I do think that it works well to use patterns where you just skip that step. It has enough interest and detail in the fabric where that top stitching, unless it's essential to the design, could probably be left out. But here is with this tape covered foot, and then we'll go ahead and show you that same one with the non-stick foot. Now with this one, you can see that this shape of this particular foot is going to continue to get stuck in these little cutouts. So I do have to be more careful positioning that with the needle down as I move forward. Now this worked a little bit better than our first example, and you can see side by side, this one is obviously much more stretched out. It's not laying flat. This one at least lays flat, but it is still hard to keep this fabric pressed flat and to stitch evenly because of the cutouts. So you, like I said, you could skip that step or put something underneath that if it's top stitching on top of some sort of stabilizer, it might work better, or you just leave the top stitching on this type out altogether. All right, we have one more technique to try with a fabric like this that's creating so much problem, and the general recommendation would be to just skip the top stitching. So we're going to try one more technique. That is to use a piece of wax paper, and you could probably also do this with tissue paper, and we are going to position this underneath, just like we did the others. The seam allowance is pressed to one side. We're going to position that so that we have the wax paper on top of the fabric like this, and then you can still see through it. You can see where your seam line is, but that will help the whole thing, potentially will help the whole thing glide through. So we'll see how this result works. Now, even before I peel this off, I have a feeling this worked much better. And this looks like a great solution for this type of fabric that might be a little bit too stretchy, a little bit wonky. But then we are just going to pull this out of here. And I pretty much here have perfect top stitching. It's a little bit crooked as it is from the seam, but compared to these other examples that you see right here, where this one was very lumpy, It didn't go evenly at all. We have a lot of kind of weird looking folded edges because of that cutout shape. The stitches are uneven. That was the first try. This is the second try where we tried to hold the threads and use the non-stick foot, and it was getting snagged inside these little holes, and itself was not quite folded. It doesn't really lay perfectly. The stitching is still slightly uneven. Now on this version, actually, I love how this came out. This actually looks really good. The stitching is even, almost exactly even from the beginning to the end for the stitch length. And like I said, it's a little bit crooked off of the seam line, but that's mostly because I'm doing this while filming at the same time. But I think if you were doing this carefully, this would be a great way to top stitch this type of fabric. I hope that these tips will really help you feel confident to work with these faux leather, vegan leather type fabrics. I'd love to see some of the stuff that you guys are working on. Please share the projects with me. Either send me a message or show them to the Facebook group. We'd love to see the different projects that you've created.